Commander Sarah Martinez had always been different, though most people never noticed at first glance. At 38 years old, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with shoulder-length brown hair that she usually kept pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were practical: dark jeans, comfortable boots, and a navy blue t-shirt that revealed nothing about her profession. She had the kind of face that blended into crowds, which had served her well throughout her military career. Tonight was supposed to be one of those rare evenings when she could forget about the weight of command that rested on her shoulders every other day of the week. The Anchors Away bar was a popular spot for military personnel from all branches, located just outside the sprawling naval base in San Diego. Sarah had chosen a corner table deliberately, somewhere she could observe the room without drawing attention to herself. She sipped her beer slowly, watching the familiar dance of off-duty military personnel trying to blow off steam. Groups of sailors clustered around pool tables, their laughter echoing over the classic rock music that poured from speakers. A few Army soldiers occupied the dartboard area, engaged in an increasingly competitive tournament that involved more trash talk than actual skill. Near the bar, a mixed group of Air Force personnel and contractors debated something intensely, their voices rising and falling with the passion of people who took their work seriously even when they were trying to relax. What none of them knew, what Sarah worked very hard to keep hidden during moments like this, was that she held one of the most sensitive and powerful positions in the entire United States military structure. As the Special Operations Coordination Director for Naval Special Warfare, Sarah Martinez didn't just work with Navy SEALs. She coordinated their missions, approved their operations, and when things went sideways in hostile territory, she was often the voice in their earpieces guiding them home. The position had no official rank that people would recognize on the street. She didn't wear admiral's stars or colonel's eagles. Her authority came from her clearance level, her experience, and the trust that had been built over 15 years of flawless service in increasingly sensitive roles. She had started as a naval intelligence analyst, working her way up through positions that required not just technical skill, but an understanding of how special operations worked at the ground level. Sarah had earned her stripes the hard way. She had spent 2 years embedded with SEAL teams as an intelligence liaison, which meant she had been shot at, had crawled through mud in hostile territory, and had made life-or-death decisions while bullets flew overhead. She had proven herself in ways that most people in military leadership never had to. The SEALs respected her because she understood their world from the inside out. Her phone buzzed against the wooden table, interrupting her thoughts. The screen showed a message from Captain Rodriguez, one of her direct reports, Team 7 requesting permission to modify extraction route. Weather turning bad over target area. Sarah typed back quickly, approving an alternate plan that she had helped develop months earlier. Even on her night off, the war never really stopped. She looked around the bar again, noting how the different service branches naturally segregated themselves. It wasn't hostility exactly, but each group carried the pride and identity of their particular piece of the military machine. The Marines clustered near the front entrance, their voices the loudest, their posture the most aggressive, even in relaxation. They had that particular swagger that came from believing they were the toughest warriors in the room. Sarah had worked with Marines before, both in joint operations and in her current role when missions required coordination between special operations units. She respected their fighting ability and their dedication, but she had also seen how their culture of aggression sometimes created problems in situations that required subtlety or diplomacy. Tonight, the Marine group seemed particularly wound up. Sarah could tell they were probably fresh off a deployment, still carrying that edge that came from months of high-stress operations. Their conversation was peppered with military slang and inside jokes that marked them as a unit that had been through something significant together. The loudest of the group was a young man who couldn't have been more than 25 years old. He had the typical Marine haircut, short on the sides, longer on top, and the kind of muscular build that came from religious devotion to physical fitness. His uniform was crisp despite being civilian clothes, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never really been challenged. Staff Sergeant Mike Chun had just returned from a 6-month deployment to Southeast Asia, where his unit had been involved in training exercises with Allied forces. It had been his first deployment as a team leader, and the success of their mission had gone to his head more than he would have admitted. His Marines looked up to him, his superiors had praised his performance, and he was riding high on the feeling that he was invincible. Sarah watched as Chun regaled his fellow Marines with stories from their deployment, his voice growing louder with each beer. She could tell he was the type who had probably been popular in high school, good at sports, used to being the center of attention. The military had given him a framework for that natural leadership, but it had also amplified some of his less attractive qualities. "I'm telling you guys," Chun was saying, his voice carrying over the music, "these foreign militaries we're training with, they've got no idea what real fighting looks like. We had to show them everything from scratch. Basic tactics, weapons handling, physical fitness standards. It was like teaching kindergarten." His audience laughed and nodded, feeding his need for validation. Sarah noticed that none of them questioned his assessment or offered different perspectives. It was a dynamic she had seen before, a charismatic leader surrounded by people who were either too junior or too comfortable to challenge his views. Chun continued his stories, each one positioning him as the hero who had saved the day through superior American military training and his own personal expertise. Sarah found herself thinking about the dozens of foreign military personnel she had worked with over the years. Many of them had skills and insights that American forces could learn from, but Chin's worldview didn't seem to have room for that possibility. As the evening progressed, Sarah noticed that Chin's attention began to wander from his own group. He started scanning the room with the entitled gaze of someone looking for entertainment or excitement. His eyes lingered on the pool tables, the dartboard, and eventually on the various women in the bar. Sarah had been in enough military environments to recognize the look. Chin was hunting for someone to impress, someone to dominate, someone who would make him feel even more powerful than his deployment stories already had. It was a dangerous mood, the kind that led to confrontations and incidents that ended military careers. She considered leaving. Her beer was almost finished, and she had an early morning meeting with senior Navy leadership about upcoming operations in the Pacific. But something kept her in her seat, an instinct that had served her well throughout her career. Sometimes trouble announced itself long before it actually arrived, and Sarah had learned to trust her ability to read the signs. Chin's group was getting louder and more aggressive in their conversation. They had moved from deployment stories to complaints about the current assignment, about officers they didn't respect, about the general state of military leadership. It was the kind of talk that was normal for enlisted personnel blowing off steam, but Sarah could hear an edge in it that suggested they were looking for a way to act out their frustrations. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Admiral Stevens, her direct superior. "Emergency briefing moved to 0800 tomorrow. New intelligence on the situation in the South China Sea. Need your assessment of SEAL team readiness for potential rapid deployment." Sarah sighed quietly and typed back her acknowledgement. The beer had been a good idea in theory, but reality had a way of intruding even on carefully planned relaxation. She was already mentally shifting gears, thinking about which teams were in the best position for deployment, what resources they would need, and how quickly they could be ready to move. She was so focused on her phone that she almost missed the moment when Chin's attention finally settled on her. When she looked up, she found him staring directly at her with the calculating look of a predator who had identified his target. Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine. Not fear, exactly, but the recognition that a situation was about to escalate beyond what she could control through simple avoidance. Chin said something to his friends that made them all turn to look at Sarah. She could see them evaluating her, making judgments based on nothing more than her appearance, and the fact that she was sitting alone. In their eyes, she was just another civilian, another weekend warrior, another person who had never experienced real military life. Sarah finished her beer and placed the empty bottle carefully on the table. She had dealt with aggressive military personnel before, both men and women, both American and foreign. The key was usually to disengage early, to avoid giving them the confrontation they were looking for. But something about Chin's body language told her that he wasn't going to make disengagement easy. She stood up slowly, gathering her purse and her jacket. The movement caught Chin's attention even more directly, and she saw him straighten up in his chair. His friends were watching now, too, sensing that their evening's entertainment was about to begin. Sarah had learned a long time ago that sometimes the best way to avoid a fight was to make it clear that you weren't an easy target. She straightened her shoulders, let her natural confidence show in her posture, and began walking toward the exit. She didn't hurry, didn't show fear, but she also didn't linger or give Chen any excuse to engage with her. She was almost to the door when she heard the chair scrape behind her. Chen was standing up, probably making some excuse to his friends about needing another beer or going to the bathroom. Sarah didn't turn around, but she could feel him following her, matching her pace, waiting for the right moment to make his move. The bar's exit opened onto a small outdoor seating area before leading to the parking lot. Sarah stepped outside, hoping that the change of venue would discourage Chun for whatever he was planning. The cool night air was a relief after the stuffy atmosphere inside, and she took a deep breath as she reached into her purse for her car keys. She heard the door open behind her and knew without looking that Chun had followed her outside. His footsteps were deliberate, confident, the walk of someone who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. Sarah found her keys and continued toward her car, still hoping to avoid whatever confrontation Chen was planning. "Hey." Chen's voice carried clearly in the quiet night air. "Hey, you." Sarah kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding to aggressive strangers was usually a mistake. The best policy was to get his safety and let security or law enforcement handle any problems. But Chen wasn't going to be deterred by being ignored. "I'm talking to you." His voice was louder now, with an edge of annoyance that suggested he wasn't used to being ignored. "Don't be rude." Sarah reached her car, a modest sedan that was as unremarkable as everything else about her appearance. She had the key ready and was reaching for the door handle when Chen finally caught up with her. She could smell the beer on his breath and see the aggressive confidence in his posture as he positioned himself between her and the car door. "What's your hurry?" Chen asked, his tone suggesting that the question wasn't really optional. "I just wanted to introduce myself. Staff Sergeant Mike Chun, United States Marine Corps." He said it like it was supposed to mean something to her, like the title alone should command her respect and attention. Sarah looked at him calmly, evaluating her options. Chun was drunk enough to be unpredictable, but not so drunk that he was incapacitated. He was larger and stronger than her, and he had the kind of training that would make him dangerous in a physical confrontation. But she also had advantages that he couldn't see: training of her own, experience in hostile situations, and, most importantly, a level of authority that would end his military career if he made the wrong choice in the next few minutes. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady and controlled. "I need to get in my car." Chen smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Come on, don't be like that. I was just trying to be social. You looked lonely in there, sitting all by yourself. I thought maybe you could use some company." Sarah recognized the script. She had seen it played out dozens of times in bars around military bases all over the world. The aggressive serviceman, usually male, who decided that a woman's presence in his space meant she was available for his entertainment. The assumption that civilian women were fair game for whatever attention he decided to give them. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, still keeping her voice level. "Please move so I can get to my car." Chen's expression darkened. He wasn't used to being dismissed so directly, especially by someone he saw as beneath his notice. In his world, his rank and his service record meant something. They commanded respect from civilians who had never worn a uniform or faced enemy fire. "You know what your problem is?" Chun said, stepping closer. Sarah could see his friends watching from the bar's windows, probably taking bets on how this would play out. "Your problem is you don't know how to show respect when you're talking to someone who's actually served this country." Sarah felt the familiar calm that had served her well in dozens of crisis situations throughout her career. Chen had just made a crucial mistake. He had assumed that she was a civilian with no understanding of military culture or military law. That assumption was about to cost him more than he could possibly imagine. "I understand you've been drinking," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that her subordinates would have recognized immediately. "I'm going to suggest that you step aside and return to your friends. This doesn't have to become a problem, but Chen was past the point of listening to reasonable suggestions. The beer, the deployment high, and the audience of his fellow Marines had created a toxic combination that was pushing him toward a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. "Oh, it's already a problem," Chen said, reaching out to grab Sarah's arm. "See, I don't like being disrespected by civilians who think they're too good to talk to real soldiers." That was the moment everything changed. The moment Chen put his hands on her, he crossed a line that separated stupid behavior from career-ending mistakes. And it was the moment that Sarah Martinez stopped being a woman trying to avoid conflict and became a commander who had sent men into battle and brought them home alive. What happened next would become legendary in certain military circles, a story that would be told and retold as a cautionary tale about assumptions, respect, and the danger of underestimating the quiet person in the corner. The moment Chen's hand closed around Sarah's arm, something shifted in the air between them. To him, it was just another power play, another way to assert dominance over someone he saw as weak. To Sarah, it was assault on a federal officer, interference with a military operation coordinator, and about 6 other violations that could send Chen to military prison for years. But more than that, it was personal. Sarah had spent 15 years proving herself in a male-dominated field where physical intimidation was often the first resort of men who couldn't compete with her intellectually. She had been grabbed, pushed, threatened, and challenged by bigger, stronger men who thought her gender made her an easy target. Each time, she had found ways to turn their assumptions against them. "Let go of my arm," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a tone that had once stopped a Navy SEAL team leader mid-sentence during a heated argument about mission parameters. It carried authority that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. Chen's grip tightened instead of loosening. "Or what? You gonna call your boyfriend? Maybe Daddy will come save you." His friends were laughing now, enjoying the show through the bar windows. To them, this was just entertainment, their tough squad leader putting some uppity civilian in her place. Sarah looked directly into Chen's eyes, and for the first time, he saw something there that made him slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't fear or submission. It was the kind of cold assessment that comes from someone calculating exactly how to neutralize a threat. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Sarah said quietly, using his name and rank for the first time. Chen's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't told her his full rank, and most civilians wouldn't know the proper way to address a Marine Staff Sergeant. "You're currently committing assault on a federal officer. You have approximately 5 seconds to release my arm and step back, or this situation will escalate in ways you cannot imagine." The use of his proper rank and title sent a chill through Chen that the beer couldn't quite mask. Suddenly, the woman in front of him didn't seem quite so helpless or civilian. The way she spoke, the terminology she used, the complete absence of fear in her voice, it all suggested that his assumptions might have been dangerously wrong. But Chen was in too deep to back down now. His friends were watching, his reputation was on the line, and his pride wouldn't let him be intimidated by someone he still saw as beneath him. "Federal officer?" Chen laughed, but the sound was forced. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm a United States Marine. I don't take orders from civilians, especially not from women who think they can throw around big words to scare people." Sarah sighed quietly. She had given him multiple opportunities to walk away, multiple chances to avoid the consequences that were now inevitable. In her years of military service, she had learned that sometimes people had to face the full weight of their choices before they understood the magnitude of their mistakes. "Computer, activate Emergency Protocol 77 Alpha," Sarah said clearly, speaking to what appeared to be empty air. Chen looked around confused, wondering who she was talking to. But Sarah wasn't talking to anyone in the immediate area. She was talking to the AI system that monitored all communications from personnel with her level of security clearance. The system that recorded everything, tracked everything, and could mobilize resources anywhere in the world within minutes. "Voice pattern confirmed," came a crisp female voice from Sarah's phone, which she hadn't even appeared to activate. "Commander Martinez, emergency protocol activated. Please state the nature of your situation." Chen's face went white. Commander wasn't a rank that civilians held. And emergency protocols weren't something that random people could activate by talking to their phones. I'm being physically restrained by Staff Sergeant Michael Chun, USMC, service number 23478912334. Sarah continued in the same calm tone. Request immediate backup and prepare to initiate disciplinary proceedings under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Chin's grip on her arm loosened involuntarily. She knew his full service number, something that wasn't publicly available information. She was speaking in official military terminology with the kind of casual familiarity that came from years of experience. And somehow, her phone was responding to voice commands that he had never heard before. Backup dispatched from Coronado Naval Base. The voice from the phone continued. Estimated arrival time, 4 minutes. Recording all audio and environmental data. Please maintain current position, Commander. Commander? Chin's voice cracked slightly. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. Commanders in the Navy were serious officers, people with real power and authority. They weren't random women sitting alone in bars near military bases. You want to know who I am? Sarah asked, her voice still deadly calm. Chin's hand was still on her arm, but his grip had become loose and uncertain. My name is Sarah Martinez. I am the Special Operations Coordination Director for Naval Special Warfare. I report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on matters involving SEAL team operations. I have clearance levels that you've never heard of, and I coordinate missions that your clearance level will never be high enough to know about. Chun stared at her, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process this information. Special Operations Coordination Director wasn't just a title. It was a position that carried authority over some of the most elite military units in the world. Every SEAL team currently deployed overseas reports to my office, Sarah continued. When they need extraction from hostile territory, they call me. When they need intelligence updates during live operations, they call me. When they need someone to authorize lethal force in politically sensitive situations, they call me. Chin's hand dropped from her arm completely. Around them, the night seemed to have gotten quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see how this would play out. The 3 SEAL teams currently operating in Southeast Asia, Sarah continued relentlessly. They're in country because I approve their mission parameters. The special operations training exercise that your unit probably provided perimeter security for last month, I designed it. The reason you think foreign militaries need American training? It's because you've only been exposed to the operations I've allowed you to see. Chun took an involuntary step backward. Everything Sarah was saying aligned with things he had seen during his deployment but hadn't understood. Security briefings he hadn't been cleared for. Training exercises where Marines provided support for operations they weren't told about. Elite units that came and went without explanation. You thought you were impressive because you led a successful training mission? Sarah asked. Staff Sergeant, you led that mission because I approved the training parameters that made success possible. You trained foreign military units using techniques that my office helped develop. You succeeded because people like me created the framework for your success. The sound of vehicles approaching broke through the night air. Chun looked toward the parking lot entrance and saw 2 military police vehicles with their lights flashing, followed by a black SUV with government plates. The cavalry that Sarah had summoned was arriving with military precision. Here's what's going to happen now, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone she used when briefing SEAL teams before dangerous missions. Those are military police officers who are going to take you into custody for assault on a federal officer. You'll be held pending an investigation that will examine not just tonight's incident, but your entire service record for patterns of behavior that might indicate unsuitability for continued military service. Chun watched in horror as 6 military police officers emerged from the vehicles, along with 2 men in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of senior intelligence officers. This wasn't just backup. This was the kind of response reserved for serious threats to national security personnel. But that's not the worst part, Sarah continued. The worst part is that every Marine in your unit, everyone who was inside that bar watching you harass me, is now part of an official investigation. Their clearances will be reviewed, their fitness for duty will be questioned, and their career prospects will be permanently affected by their association with tonight's events. Chin's friends, who had been watching through the windows with amusement, were now looking terrified as military police entered the bar. They had gone from being spectators at what they thought was harmless entertainment to being participants in a career-ending incident. Staff Sergeant Chun, one of the approaching MP officers, called out, "Please step away from Commander Martinez and place your hands where we can see them." Chun complied automatically, his military training overriding his shock and confusion. But his mind was still reeling from the revelation of who he had been threatening. Commander Martinez wasn't just any officer. She was someone whose authority extended into areas of the military that he had never even imagined. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the MP sergeant asked Sarah, while two other officers positioned themselves on either side of Chun. "No physical injury," Sarah replied. "But I want a full report filed, and I want this incident investigated thoroughly." Staff Sergeant Chin's behavior tonight suggests either a serious alcohol problem, a fundamental misunderstanding of military discipline and civilian relations, or both. Chin wanted to protest, to explain that he had just been trying to be friendly, that he hadn't meant any harm. But the words died in his throat as he realized how pathetic any excuse would sound. He had physically grabbed and threatened someone who held a position of authority that was so far above his own level that they might as well have been from different military organizations entirely. Commander Martinez, one of the men from the SUV, approached. He was older, probably in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of military service in dangerous places. "Admiral Stevens sends his regards and wants to ensure you're not injured. He also wants you to know that this incident will be handled with the full weight of naval discipline." Sarah nodded. Admiral Stevens was her direct superior, a man who had commanded aircraft carrier battle groups and coordinated joint operations across multiple theaters. The fact that he was personally involved in this incident meant that Chin's military career was effectively over. "Why I don't understand," Chin said desperately, looking at Sarah as the MPs prepared to escort him away, "is why you were just sitting there like a regular person. Why didn't you say who you were? Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Staff Sergeant, why would I need to announce my authority to enjoy a beer in peace? Why would my rank need to be visible for me to deserve basic respect and courtesy? And, most importantly, why would you think that my apparent lack of authority gave you the right to put your hands on me?" Chen had no answer for that. In the harsh light of the police vehicles, surrounded by officers who clearly viewed him as a serious threat, his actions seemed not just wrong, but inexplicably stupid. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was," Sarah continued. "The problem is that you thought it didn't matter who I was. You saw a woman alone and decided that gave you the right to intimidate and physically restrain her. That attitude is what's going to end your military career, not your ignorance of my specific position." As the MPs led Chin away, Sarah could hear him trying to explain to anyone who would listen that he hadn't known, that he had just been trying to be friendly, that this was all a misunderstanding. But his protest fell on deaf ears. In the military justice system, ignorance was not a defense for assault, and intent mattered less than actions. Sarah watched the police vehicles disappear into the night, taking Chin away to a holding cell where he would have plenty of time to think about the choices that had led him to this moment. Tomorrow, he would face a court-martial that would examine not just tonight's incident, but his entire approach to military service and civilian interaction. The incident was over, but its consequences were just beginning. And Sarah knew that by morning, this story would be making its way through the informal networks that connected military bases around the world, serving as a cautionary tale about assumptions, respect, and the danger of underestimating the quiet person in the corner. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that San Diego was famous for, but Staff Sergeant Michael Chun couldn't appreciate it from inside the holding cell at Coronado Naval Base. He had spent the night replaying the events at the bar, trying to understand how what seemed like a simple interaction had exploded into a career-ending catastrophe. Chin's cellmates were a collection of military personnel who had made various poor decisions. A sailor caught driving under the influence, an Army specialist who had gone AWOL, and a Coast Guard petty officer involved in a bar fight. But none of their situations compared to the magnitude of Chin's problem. At 0800 hours, Chun was escorted to an interview room where he found himself facing a panel that made his stomach drop. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison from Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division sat in the center, flanked by a Navy JAG officer and a civilian from what Chun guessed was military intelligence. This wasn't a simple disciplinary hearing. This was the kind of investigation reserved for serious criminal charges. Staff Sergeant Chun, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison began, consulting a thick folder that had somehow accumulated overnight. Do you understand why you're here? Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Chun began, but Harrison cut him off with a raised hand. There's no misunderstanding, Staff Sergeant. You physically restrained a senior military officer while under the influence of alcohol. You threatened and intimidated someone whose security clearance is higher than mine, higher than anyone's in this room, and whose work directly impacts ongoing special operations around the world. The civilian leaned forward. Mr. Chun, I'm Special Agent Rodriguez from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. When someone with Commander Martinez's clearance level reports an incident, it triggers automatic security reviews that go all the way to the Pentagon. This isn't just about your behavior last night. It's about whether you represent a security risk to ongoing operations. Chun felt the blood drain from his face. Security risk investigations could destroy not just his military career, but his ability to work in any field that required background checks. Sir, I had no idea who she was. I was just trying to be friendly. The JAG officer, Commander Patricia Williams, opened her own folder. Staff Sergeant, let's examine what you consider friendly behavior. According to witness statements, you followed Commander Martinez outside the bar after she had clearly indicated she wanted to be left alone. You cornered her in the parking lot, preventing her from reaching her vehicle. You grabbed her arm when she tried to leave. Which part of that sequence seems friendly to you? Chun realized that when presented as a sequence of deliberate actions rather than a spontaneous interaction, his behavior sounded much worse. Ma'am, I was drunk. I wasn't thinking clearly. Alcohol doesn't create behavior, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison replied sharply. It reveals it. Your actions last night suggest a pattern of thinking that views women as targets for intimidation when you're not getting the attention you believe you deserve. Special Agent Rodriguez opened a laptop and turned it toward Chun. We've been reviewing your social media posts, your service record, and interviews with your current and former colleagues. There are some concerning patterns we need to discuss. The screen showed screenshots of Chun's Facebook and Instagram posts from the past 2 years. Posts where he had made disparaging comments about female military personnel. Photos from bars with captions about hunting and conquering. Comments on other people's posts that revealed attitudes about women, civilians, and authority that painted him as someone with serious issues about respect and power. This post from 6 months ago, Commander Williams pointed to the screen, shows you making sexual comments about a female officer in your unit. This one from last year shows you mocking civilian protesters as weak and suggesting they need to be taught respect. These aren't the social media posts of someone who is just having an off night, Staff Sergeant. Chun stared at the posts, seeing his own words displayed in the context of an official investigation. Things he had thought were funny or clever now looked like evidence of character flaws that made him unsuitable for military service. Let's talk about your deployment record, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison continued. Your unit provided security support for several special operations training exercises. Did you ever wonder why you weren't briefed on the full scope of those operations? Sir, I assumed it was need-to-know basis classification, Chun replied. It was. And the person who determined what you needed to know, the person who set the parameters for your involvement, the person who decided whether you and your Marines were trustworthy enough to be anywhere near those operations. That was Commander Martinez. The room fell silent as Chun processed this information. Sarah Martinez hadn't just been some random woman in a bar. She had been evaluating his performance, his professionalism, his fitness for sensitive assignments. And he had grabbed her arm and threatened her. Special Agent Rodriguez pulled up another document on his laptop. Staff Sergeant, your unit was being considered for expanded roles in special operations support. There were discussions about additional training, higher clearance levels, and assignment to more sensitive missions. Commander Martinez was reviewing personnel files to determine who would be eligible for those opportunities. Chun felt like he was falling through space. Not only had he attacked someone who could end his career, but he had attacked someone who had been in the process of potentially advancing it. Your file, Commander Williams added, showed promise. Good physical fitness scores, solid leadership evaluations from your platoon commanders, successful completion of advanced training courses. As of yesterday morning, you are on a list of personnel recommended for promotion consideration. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair. As of this morning, you're facing charges of assault on a federal officer, conduct unbecoming, and violation of orders regarding treatment of civilians and fellow service members. The minimum sentence, if you're convicted on all charges, is dismissal from service with loss of benefits and possible federal prison time. Chin's hands were shaking now. His military career wasn't just over. His entire future was in jeopardy. Sir, is there anything I can do? Any way to make this right? Making it right would involve inventing a time machine, Special Agent Rodriguez replied dryly. But there are ways to minimize the damage to yourself and, more importantly, to your fellow Marines who are now under investigation because of their association with your behavior. Commander Williams pulled out a recording device. Your unit members are being interviewed today about their knowledge of your attitudes toward women, civilians, and authority. Several of them have already admitted to being aware of your social media posts and your tendency toward aggressive behavior when drinking. Their careers are now at risk because they failed to report concerning behavior by a fellow Marine. Chun thought about his friends, good Marines who had worked hard to build their careers, now facing investigation because they had failed to speak up about his behavior. The guilt was overwhelming. We're prepared to offer you a deal, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said. Full cooperation with our investigation, including testimony about any other incidents of inappropriate behavior in your unit. Complete honesty about your own attitudes and actions, not just last night, but throughout your service. And agreement to accept administrative discharge in lieu of court-martial. What does that mean for my future? Chen asked. It means you leave the military with an other than honorable discharge instead of facing criminal charges, Commander Williams replied. You'll lose most of your veterans' benefits, but you won't go to federal prison. You'll be able to find employment, though not in any field requiring security clearances. Special Agent Rodriguez added, it also means you'll participate in a comprehensive debriefing about toxic masculinity and inappropriate behavior in military units. Your case will be used as a training example for other service members about the consequences of sexual harassment and assault. Chen realized he was being offered a way out that was both merciful and devastating. He would avoid prison, but his military career, the thing that had given him identity, purpose, and pride, would be over. Worse, he would become a cautionary tale, his mistakes held up as an example of how not to behave. I need to know, Chen said quietly, what happened to my Marines? The guys who were with me last night. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison consulted his notes. 2 of them are facing charges for failure to intervene when they witnessed harassment. 3 others are receiving formal reprimands for failure to report concerning behavior. 1, Private Rodriguez, actually tried to discourage your behavior and suggested you leave the bar. He's receiving commendation for showing proper judgment and moral courage. Chen remembered Private Rodriguez, the youngest member of his unit, trying to suggest they leave the bar early. Chen had ignored him, brushed off his concerns as weakness. Now that young Marine was being praised while Chun faced disgrace. The Marine Corps is implementing new policies about bystander intervention based partly on this incident, Commander Williams added. Service members will be required to take action when they witness inappropriate behavior, not just ignore it and hope it goes away. Chen realized that his actions hadn't just destroyed his own career. They had created ripple effects throughout the military justice system. New policies would be written because of his behavior. Training programs would be modified. Other service members would face additional requirements and responsibilities. There's one more thing, Special Agent Rodriguez said, consulting his own notes. Commander Martinez has requested permission to address your unit before they're reassigned. She wants to speak to them about respect, professionalism, and the real nature of military service. The idea of facing Sarah Martinez again, this time in front of his fellow Marines, was almost unbearable. But Chen realized it was probably necessary. His unit needed to understand who they had been laughing at, what they had been supporting, and why their silence had been interpreted as complicity. "Will you accept our offer?" Lieutenant Colonel Harrison asked. Chen looked around the room at the three officers who held his future in their hands. He thought about his parents, who had been so proud when he enlisted. He thought about his girlfriend, who had been planning their wedding around his military schedule. He thought about the Marines he had led, now facing consequences for his poor judgment. "Yes, sir," Chen said quietly. "I accept." Commander Williams made a note in her folder. "Very well. You'll be processed out of service within 30 days. The administrative discharge will be reflected in your permanent record, but you'll avoid criminal prosecution. Your cooperation with this investigation may be noted as a mitigating factor in your final evaluation." As the officers prepared to leave, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison turned back to Chun. "Staff Sergeant, do you understand now why this incident was so serious?" Chun nodded slowly. "Sir, I thought I was just talking to some random woman who was being rude to a Marine. I did understand that my behavior was wrong regardless of who she was, and I especially didn't understand that I had attacked someone who had dedicated her career to protecting people like me." "That's exactly right," Harrison replied. "Commander Martinez has spent 15 years coordinating operations that have saved American lives, including Marine lives. She's been shot at in service to this country. She's made decisions under fire that kept special operations teams alive in hostile territory. And you thought you had the right to put your hands on her because she didn't want to talk to you in a bar." Chun felt the full weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. He hadn't just harassed a woman. He had assaulted someone who had earned more respect than he could even comprehend. As he was escorted back to his cell to await processing, Chun began to understand that the real tragedy wasn't the end of his military career. It was the realization that he had never really understood what military service meant in the first place. 3 days after the incident, Sarah Martinez stood in front of Conference Room C at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, reviewing her notes one final time. Through the window, she could see Chin's former unit filing into the room, their faces displaying a mixture of anxiety, shame, and curiosity. These Marines had requested this meeting through their commanding officer, wanted to understand what had really happened and how they should have handled the situation differently. Sarah had agreed to the meeting partly because Admiral Stevens had suggested it would be valuable for military education, but mostly because she believed these young Marines deserved to understand the full context of what they had witnessed. They had made mistakes, but those mistakes came from ignorance rather than malice, and ignorance could be corrected through education. The conference room was standard military issue: fluorescent lighting, beige walls, a long table surrounded by uncomfortable chairs. But today it would serve as a classroom where some of the most important lessons these Marines would ever learn would be delivered by someone they had never expected to see again. At exactly 1,400 hours, Sarah entered the room. The Marines snapped to attention automatically, their training overriding their confusion about why they were showing military courtesy to someone they had last seen as Chin's victim in a bar parking lot. "At ease," Sarah said, her voice carrying the natural authority that came from 15 years of military command. "Please take your seats." As the Marines settled into chairs, Sarah could see them studying her appearance, trying to reconcile the woman in the military-style business suit with the casual bar patron they remembered. Today, there was no mistaking her authority. Her bearing, her posture, and the respect shown by the senior officers who had escorted her made it clear that they were in the presence of someone significant. "I'm Commander Sarah Martinez," she began, placing a thick folder on the table. "For those of you who weren't properly introduced the other night, I serve as Special Operations Coordination Director for Naval Special Warfare. That means I coordinate operations involving Navy SEAL teams, Marine Special Operations units, and other classified assets around the world." Private Rodriguez, the young Marine who had tried to discourage Chin's behavior, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" "Granted. Ma'am, we had no idea who you were. I mean, we knew something was wrong with what Chun was doing, but we didn't understand the full situation." Sarah nodded. "Private Rodriguez, that's exactly why I'm here. I want to discuss not just what happened the other night, but why it happened and how similar situations should be handled in the future. She opened her folder and pulled out a series of photographs, spreading them across the table. The images showed military operations in various locations around the world, desert training exercises, jungle operations, maritime insertions, and urban warfare scenarios. These photographs were taken during operations that my office coordinated over the past 2 years, Sarah continued. Some of them involve Marines from this base, including missions that your unit provided security support for. You've been part of operations that you weren't fully briefed on because of classification levels and need-to-know protocols. Corporal Williams, one of Chen's closest friends in the unit, leaned forward to study the photographs. "Ma'am, I recognize this location. We were there during the training exercise in Thailand last year." "That's correct," Sarah replied. "That exercise involved coordination between American Special Operations teams and Thai military units. Your unit provided perimeter security, while SEAL teams conducted training operations with Thai Special Forces. The exercise was designed to improve interoperability between allied forces in case of regional conflicts." She pointed to another photograph. This operation in the Philippines involved extracting American civilians from a hostile area while coordinating with Filipino military units. The Marines who provided security for that operation were from this base, though not from your specific unit. Sarah could see the Marines beginning to understand the scope and importance of the operations they had been supporting without fully realizing it. Their role had been more significant than they had known, and their professionalism had been more important than they had understood. "The point I'm making," Sarah continued, "is that you've all been serving in roles that required trust from senior leadership. You've been given access to classified locations, introduced to foreign military personnel, and trusted to maintain operational security about activities you weren't fully briefed on." Sergeant Thompson, Chen's second-in-command, spoke up. "Ma'am, are you saying that our clearance levels are being reviewed because of what happened with Chun?" "I'm saying that trust is earned through demonstrated judgment and professionalism," Sarah replied. "When service members demonstrate poor judgment in their personal time, it raises questions about their judgment during professional duties. When they fail to intervene in inappropriate behavior, it raises questions about their moral courage under pressure." She pulled out another document, this one showing a flowchart of command relationships in special operations. "Let me explain something about how special operations work. When SEAL teams are deployed in hostile territory, they depend on support from conventional forces, Marines, sailors, soldiers, and airmen who provide security, logistics, communications, and intelligence support. Those support personnel may not know the details of the mission, but their professionalism and judgment can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." Private Rodriguez raised his hand again. "Ma'am, how do our actions in a bar relate to mission success or failure?" "Excellent question, Private. The same judgment that leads someone to physically restrain a woman in a parking lot is the judgment they'll use when deciding whether to report suspicious behavior during a security assignment. The same lack of moral courage that prevents someone from intervening when they witness harassment is the lack of moral courage that prevents them from speaking up when they see security breaches or procedural violations." Sarah could see the Marines beginning to make connections between their personal behavior and their professional responsibilities. These weren't separate aspects of their lives. They were different expressions of the same character traits. "Let me give you a specific example," Sarah continued. "Last year, a Marine security team at an overseas base noticed that a local contract worker was taking photographs of sensitive areas. 3 Marines thought it was suspicious, but they didn't want to create problems for the contractor, who seemed like a nice person. They failed to report it. The room was completely silent now, with all the Marines focused intently on Sarah's words. That contractor was later identified as an intelligence operative working for a hostile foreign government. The photographs he had taken were used to plan an attack that killed 4 American service members and wounded 12 others. The Marines who failed to report suspicious behavior were held partially responsible for those deaths." Corporal Williams looked stricken. "Ma'am, are you saying that our failure to stop Chun could have similar consequences?" "I'm saying that moral courage isn't something you can turn on and off depending on the situation," Sarah replied. If you don't have the courage to tell a friend that his behavior toward women is inappropriate, how can you be trusted to have the courage to report security violations that might save lives? Sergeant Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ma'am, we didn't want to get Chin in trouble. He's a good Marine most of the time, and he's been through some difficult deployments. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. Sergeant, every person in the military has been through difficult deployments. Every person in this room has faced stress, danger, and personal challenges. Those experiences don't give anyone permission to intimidate, threaten, or assault others. She pulled out her phone and placed it on the table. This device contains contact information for every SEAL team currently deployed overseas. When I send a message to one of these numbers, it reaches someone who is literally putting their life on the line for American interests. Some of them are in locations where discovery by enemy forces means torture and death. The Marines stared at the phone as if it were a weapon. These operators trust me to coordinate their support, approve their resource requests, and make decisions that affect their survival, Sarah continued. They trust me because my judgment has been tested in life and death situations. They trust me because I've proven that I won't let personal feelings or social pressure override my professional responsibilities. Private Rodriguez asked quietly, "Ma'am, what should we have done differently?" "You should have intervened immediately when Chun began following me outside," Sarah replied without hesitation. "You should have physically prevented him from cornering me in the parking lot. And when he put his hands on me, you should have forcibly removed him from the situation." "But, ma'am," Corporal Williams protested, "Chin outranked most of us, and he was our squad leader." "Corporal, rank doesn't give anyone permission to commit assault. Leadership position doesn't provide immunity from consequences. And unit loyalty doesn't mean covering up criminal behavior." Sarah's voice was firm but not angry. "If Chun had been about to drive drunk, would you have taken his keys?" "Yes, ma'am." "If Chun had been about to steal something from a base exchange, would you have stopped him?" "Yes, ma'am." "If Chun had been about to strike a fellow Marine without justification, would you have intervened?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then why didn't you intervene when he was committing assault against someone who had done nothing wrong except refuse to engage with his harassment?" The question hung in the air, forcing the Marines to confront the uncomfortable truth about their own biases and assumptions. They had seen Sarah as somehow less deserving of protection than a fellow Marine, someone whose safety was less important than their unit cohesion. Sergeant Thompson spoke slowly. "Ma'am, I think we saw you as a civilian, and we thought Chen was just being overly aggressive about trying to pick up a woman. We didn't see it as assault." "And that," Sarah replied, "is exactly the problem. You divided the world into people who deserve your protection and people who didn't. Marines and civilians, men and women, people you knew and strangers. But the military oath doesn't include exceptions based on the victim's identity." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. In clear letters, she wrote, "I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States of America." "This is the oath you swore when you enlisted," Sarah said. "The Constitution protects all Americans, not just military personnel. Your duty is to defend that document and the principles it represents, which include equal protection under law and the right to be free from assault." Turning back to the Marines, Sarah continued, "When you failed to protect me from Chin's behavior, you violated your oath. When you treated my safety as less important than your unit loyalty, you violated your oath. When you decided that intervention wasn't worth the social awkwardness, you violated your oath." Private Rodriguez raised his hand again. "Ma'am, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Sarah returned to her seat and opened another section of her folder. "The Marine Corps is implementing new policies based partly on this incident. You'll receive training on bystander intervention, sexual harassment prevention, and the proper use of authority. But policies and training can only do so much. The real change has to come from understanding why this behavior is wrong, not just being afraid of the consequences." She distributed a series of case studies to each Marine. These are real incidents from various military units where service members failed to intervene in inappropriate behavior. Some resulted in sexual assault. Some resulted in suicide by victims who felt they had no support. Some resulted in security breaches when victims were too intimidated to report suspicious activity. As the Marines read through the case studies, Sarah could see their expressions changing. These weren't abstract scenarios. They were real consequences of the same failure of moral courage that had occurred in the bar parking lot. "Ma'am," Corporal Williams said after reviewing the documents, "we really screwed up, didn't we?" "Yes, you did," Sarah replied simply. "But you screwed up from ignorance rather than malice, and ignorance can be corrected. The question now is what you do with this knowledge going forward." Sergeant Thompson looked up from his case study. "Ma'am, what happened to Chun? Is his career really over?" "Chun accepted an other-than-honorable discharge to avoid criminal prosecution," Sarah replied. "He'll be out of the Marines within a month. His military career is over, his veterans' benefits are severely limited, and he'll carry the consequences of this incident for the rest of his life." The room fell silent as the Marines processed the magnitude of the consequences their former squad leader would face. "But Chin's fate isn't the most important lesson here," Sarah continued. "The most important lesson is that you have the power to prevent situations like this from happening in the future. You have the responsibility to intervene when you witness inappropriate behavior. And you have the obligation to understand that protecting others isn't optional. It's fundamental to military service." Private Rodriguez asked, "Ma'am, will we face charges for what happened?" "Two members of your unit are receiving formal reprimands for failure to intervene," Sarah replied. "The others will receive counseling and additional training. Your unit will be subject to enhanced supervision for the next 6 months. But you'll all have the opportunity to demonstrate that you've learned from this experience." Sarah began gathering her materials, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. "I want to leave you with one final thought. Military service is about more than just following orders and completing missions. It's about upholding standards of behavior that reflect the values of the society you've sworn to protect. When you fail to protect others, you fail in your fundamental duty as service members." As the Marines prepared to leave, Sergeant Thompson approached Sarah. "Ma'am, is there anything we can do to make amends for our failure to act?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Sergeant, you can ensure that this never happens again on your watch. You can be the moral courage that prevents the next incident. And you can remember that protecting others isn't about whether they deserve it or whether it's convenient. It's about who you choose to be as a Marine and as a person." As the Marines filed out of the conference room, Sarah could see that the conversation had affected them profoundly. They understood now that their failure to act had consequences beyond Chen's career, beyond their own military records, and beyond the policies that would be changed because of this incident. They understood that they had failed to be the Marines they had sworn to be, and that understanding was the first step toward ensuring they would never fail in the same way again. 6 months after the incident at the Anchors Away bar, the story of Commander Sarah Martinez and Staff Sergeant Michael Chun had become something of a legend within military circles. Not the kind of legend that celebrates heroic actions or remarkable achievements, but the kind that serves as a permanent reminder of how quickly careers can end and how important it is to understand the true nature of military service. At the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, new SEAL candidates received a briefing that included the incident as part of their training on military bearing and civilian relations. The lesson was simple but powerful. Authority doesn't require advertisement, and respect should be given based on character rather than rank or appearance. At Marine Corps bases around the world, the case study was incorporated into leadership training programs. Young Marines learned about bystander intervention, moral courage, and the responsibility that comes with military service. The training materials didn't sensationalize the incident or turn it into entertainment. They used it as a teaching tool about the real consequences of poor judgment and failed leadership. But perhaps the most significant changes occurred in the lives of the people directly involved. Sarah Martinez returned to her duties with renewed perspective on the challenges facing military personnel transitioning between their professional and personal lives. She had always known intellectually that many service members struggled with the authority and aggression that served them well in combat situations, but created problems in civilian settings. The incident with Chun had given her first-hand insight into how that struggle could manifest in dangerous ways. She worked with military psychologists and leadership trainers to develop new protocols for helping returning veterans manage the transition from high-stress deployment environments to civilian social situations. The programs focused on helping service members understand when military bearing was appropriate and when it needed to be set aside in favor of basic human courtesy and respect. Sarah also became involved in updating the training programs for personnel with high security clearances. The incident had highlighted how behavior and personal time could impact professional responsibilities, and she helped develop guidelines for recognizing when personal conduct issues might indicate security risks. Her reputation within the special operations community, already strong before the incident, was enhanced by the professional way she had handled the situation. SEAL team leaders appreciated that she had given Chun multiple opportunities to walk away before escalating to official action, and they respected her willingness to use the incident as a teaching opportunity rather than simply pursuing maximum punishment. For the Marines in Chun's former unit, the months following the incident had been a period of intensive self-reflection and professional development. Private Rodriguez, the young Marine who had tried to discourage Chun's behavior, had been selected for advanced training and was being considered for promotion ahead of schedule. His willingness to speak up, even ineffectively, had marked him as someone with the moral courage that the Marine Corps wanted to develop. Sergeant Thompson and Corporal Williams had both received formal counseling about leadership responsibilities and bystander intervention. The experience had been humbling, but ultimately beneficial for their development as military leaders. They had learned that leadership meant more than just tactical competence. It meant having the courage to enforce standards even when it was socially uncomfortable. The unit as a whole had developed a reputation for exceptionally high standards of professional behavior. Word had spread through informal military networks that these Marines had learned important lessons about accountability and mutual responsibility. Rather than being stigmatized by their association with Chun's behavior, they had become examples of how military personnel could learn and grow from difficult experiences. Other changes rippled through the broader military system. The incident had been cited in congressional hearings about military discipline and civilian relations. New policies were implemented requiring regular training on bystander intervention and appropriate use of authority. Military leaders were required to undergo enhanced screening for attitudes toward civilians and fellow service members. But perhaps the most profound changes occurred in the life of Michael Chun himself. After his discharge from the Marine Corps, Chun had faced the difficult process of rebuilding his identity outside the military structure that had defined him for years. The transition had been painful, involving periods of depression, anger, and self-recrimination as he came to terms with the consequences of his actions. Chun had moved back to his hometown in Ohio, where he lived with his parents while looking for work and trying to understand how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. The other than honorable discharge made it difficult to find employment, especially in fields that required background checks or security clearances. Many employers were reluctant to hire someone whose military service had ended under questionable circumstances. But Chun had also been required to participate in counseling programs as part of his discharge agreement. The counseling had forced him to examine his attitudes toward women, authority, and respect in ways that were uncomfortable but ultimately necessary. He had come to understand that his problems weren't just about alcohol or poor judgment. They reflected deeper issues about how he viewed other people and his own place in the world. The counseling had also introduced Chun to other veterans who were struggling with similar issues. He learned that his problems with civilian transition were not unique, and that many former military personnel struggled to find appropriate ways to express the leadership skills and sense of purpose that had defined their military careers. Through a veterans service organization, Chun eventually found work with a nonprofit that helped at-risk youth develop discipline and life skills. The work was challenging and often frustrating, but it gave him a way to use his leadership experience in a positive way. More importantly, it helped him understand what military service should have meant, using strength and authority to protect and develop others, not to intimidate or dominate them. Chen had also written letters of apology to Sarah Martinez and to his former unit members. The letters were part of his counseling process, but they also represented genuine remorse for the consequences his actions had created for other people. He understood that the letters couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but they were an important step in taking responsibility for his choices. Sarah had received Chen's letter, but had not responded to it directly. Through military channels, she had let him know that she acknowledged his apology and respected his efforts to make positive changes in his life. She didn't forgive him. The incident had been too serious for simple forgiveness, but she recognized that he was attempting to become a better person. The story of the incident had continued to spread through military communities, but the focus had gradually shifted from the dramatic confrontation to the broader lessons about military service and civilian relations. Young service members learned about the importance of moral courage, the responsibility of leadership, and the need to understand that military authority came with obligations to protect others rather than exploit them. Training programs began incorporating scenarios where service members had to choose between unit loyalty and doing the right thing. The exercises were designed to help military personnel understand that real leadership sometimes required standing up to popular leaders who were making wrong choices. The incident also became part of discussions about military culture and toxic masculinity. Military leaders recognized that the aggressive confidence that made good warriors could become problematic when not properly channeled, and that military training needed to include education about appropriate behavior in civilian settings. For Sarah, the incident had reinforced her belief that military service was fundamentally about protecting others and serving something larger than oneself. She had seen how quickly that mission could be corrupted when service members began to view their authority as something that elevated them above others rather than something that obligated them to serve others. She continued to coordinate special operations around the world, making decisions that affected the safety of some of America's most elite military personnel. But she also made sure that the lessons from the incident were incorporated into the training and preparation of the teams under her command. They needed to understand that their skills and authority were tools for protecting others, not weapons for intimidating those they saw as beneath them. The bar where the incident had occurred eventually put up a small plaque near the entrance. It didn't describe the specific incident, but it included a simple message. Military personnel are reminded that wearing the uniform, whether visible or not, means representing the values of service, honor, and protection of others. The plaque served as a quiet reminder that military service extended beyond official duties and formal situations. It was about character, judgment, and the understanding that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. As time passed, the incident became less about the specific people involved and more about the enduring lessons it represented. Military personnel learned that authority was a responsibility, not a privilege. They learned that moral courage was essential to good leadership. Most importantly, they learned that military service meant something more than just following orders and completing missions. It meant becoming the kind of person worthy of the trust that society placed in its military. The question, "Ever heard of me?" had become a reminder that assumptions about others could be dangerous, that respect should be given freely rather than earned through displays of power, and that the most important authority was the authority to protect and serve others. In the end, the incident had served its purpose not as entertainment or drama, but as education. It had reminded everyone involved that military service was about more than personal achievement or career advancement. It was about becoming worthy of the uniform, whether that uniform was visible or not. And in conference rooms and training facilities around the world, young military personnel continued to learn the most important lesson of all, that true strength lay not in the power to intimidate others, but in the wisdom to know when that power should never be used.